In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Freezing Battlemage build. This is a level 150 version of the Battlemage build that incorporates some frost spells into its repertoire. A lot of people have been asking for an update to this build, and in this video I want to show you how to play this build effectively at level 150 to get the most possible damage. If you remember, the Battlemage focused on using sorceries like the Carrion Sword sorceries, Carrion Piercer, Carrion Slicer, and Carrion Greatsword, and we used most of those spells in this build as well with a couple of variations. So first up, let's talk about the staff that we use for this build. The staff we use for this build is Lusat's Glintstone staff, and the reason for that is because that's going to give us absolutely maximum damage that we can deal with a staff for this setup. The amount of FP that it increases 50% per spell cast is not so significant for Carrion Slicer, which is the primary spell we use for this build, because it's only 6 FP. So raising that cost to 9 FP is not substantial. You want to get maximum damage per swing with this so that you can just melt enemies and bosses, and FP shouldn't be that much of an issue for you at this point in the game when you can have 30, 35 mines, something like that, and you still have 3 or 4, maybe even 5 blue flasks to, get you through from checkpoint to checkpoint. So you're not super concerned with FP, and we want to get maximum damage. Additionally, you can use a second staff in your offhand, the Carrion Glintstone staff, which further boosts Carrion Sword sorceries, to get the damage increase from that staff without ever having to upgrade it or actually cast the spell with it. So if you hold that in your offhand, you're going to get the damage increase from that to Carrion Slicer, Carrion Piercer, and Carrion Greatsword, which is phenomenal. The other alternative is using the Jellyfish Shield, which actually boosts the damage even a bit more than Carrion Glintstone staff does. However, it requires 20 points into strength and 14 into dexterity, and you have to use the weapon ability of that shield in order to buff your overall damage. So there is the downside there, but the upside is that you can block. You can have a shield that does okay-ish block, and it also boosts other spells we use for this build that aren't Carrion Sword sorceries. So if you're, using ranged spells, then this is also a good option. And you can actually put both of them in your left hand and swap back and forth as necessary. So maybe there's a section where you want to cast some spells that aren't Carrion Sword sorceries, and you can use this to buff the damage of those spells and then switch back to the other one so that you don't have to keep buffing. The choice is really up to you. You can use either one of them or you can use both, and they both have their pluses and minuses. When it comes to armor for this build, I like to use the Snow Witch hat because that increases the damage of cold sorceries by 10%, and I do use a Duelist Moonblade with this build and Glintstone Ice Crag, so it's going to boost the damage of those, as well as using Freezing Mist, although that doesn't really do much damage. Beyond that, what other armor you want to wear is completely up to you. I try to get as much protection as possible. I do have a good amount of endurance with this build, because you're spamming Carrion Slicer, so you can get some decent protection with some decently heavy armor if you want, depending on what your setup is. Also, if you find yourself not using the cold sorceries with this build, you could switch the helmet out for something that increases intelligence. Just make sure you really don't go too much higher than 80 intelligence. The investment after that point isn't substantial, so I don't recommend going higher than that. Instead, you probably want to put points into something like Mind in order to be able to cast more spells easily. When it comes for talismans for this build, we have the Graven School Talisman, the Graven Mask Talisman, Ritual Sword Talisman, and Magic Scorpion Charm. Both the Graven School Talisman and Graven Mask Talisman increase the damage that you deal with sorceries, and you can stack these together. This is going to boost, any spell that you deal that does magic damage that's a sorcery. So that's basically all spells we use, which is great. And Ritual Sword Talisman just boosts your overall damage by 10% as long as you're at full health. So that's going to boost all of our spells as well. And Magic Scorpion Charm boosts any spell or damage that's magic damage, which all these spells are. So these are really, really good talismans to help you get the most possible damage you can. I do want to note that you could use something like the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or Sword Insignia as well, as that does trigger from spamming Carrion Slicer. However, I do find that by the time you do 5 or 6 hits in order to trigger the first level of this buff, the enemy is usually either dead, or if you're fighting a boss fight, you don't have time to attack much longer than that. Like, you're not really going to get more than about 5 or 6 swings in a row on a boss without having to roll away. So I don't feel like it's a great fit for that, but it does work in terms of boosting your overall damage with these sorceries, so just keep that in mind. So the way this build generally plays is that you're going to run around on the landscape, and you're going to use Glintstone Ice Crag as you need to pick off enemies at range, or you can use a different spell, like Great Glintstone Shard if you prefer longer range even. The upside of the Ice Crag is that it can help build up the Frostbite status effect, which when triggered on an enemy will reduce their damage absorption, allowing you to deal even more damage. This is really only applicable, however, to, tough enemies, as you'll usually kill them outright before you ever trigger Frostbite with this spell or other ice spells, unless you're using Freezing Mist. So it's not so important for those, but for boss fights, it's good to know. But primarily what you want to do is you want to lean into Carry and Slicer. You're going to run around and try and kill things in 1 or 2 Carry and Slicer attacks. It's going to cost about 18 FP to do that, which isn't a ton. You could actually put something like the Ancestral Spirit Horn on here instead of like Ritual Sword Talisman if you want to conserve a little FP. But because we have like 30 to 35 mine, depending on what your setup is, FP should not be a huge problem for you, especially when, you're 1 or 2 shotting most enemies. And when you get to tough enemies, you're going to use your Flask of Wondrous Physique, and you're just going to go to town spamming Carry and Slicer or ranging them down with Glintstone Icecrack. Adula's Moonblade, in my opinion, is good in AoE situations where you're outnumbered or when you're fighting big enemies that are just difficult to hit with Carry and Slicer. This really does well, particularly against like dragons and things like that, where it's hard to, lock onto them and attack. This gives you like a free aim option that hardly ever misses. One interesting thing that I noticed is doing a comparison between Carrion Greatsword and Adula's Moonblade is that Carrion Greatsword actually does more damage if you're not using the Snow Witch Hat. So if you're not using the Snow Witch Hat, I would recommend using the Carrion Greatsword if you're just trying to get max damage. But the other upside to the Adula's Moonblade is that it shoots out a wave, so it has a longer range, and it does build up some of that Frostbite status effect. So it's kind of up to you what you want to use if you're not using the Snow Witch Hat, but if you're using the Snow Witch Hat, it's going to outperform Carrion Greatsword. You can add other spells here as well, like Loretta's Great Bow if you need some really, really long range. But the focus of this build is generally trying to, get in close to melee range and use Carrion Slicer as your primary melee attack. And Carrion Piercer, if you use that in this build, is mostly there for like NPC invaders or just regular invaders in general. Or maybe like on horseback, fighting enemies on horseback, as it has incredible range. And you can sort of start the windup for it before enemies get into range, and then they'll usually run right into it. It's not very FP efficient though, so it's not something that you can really use as a default attack. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 40 Vigor, 30 Mind, 22 Endurance, 20 Strength, 14 Dexterity, 80 Intelligence, 14 Faith, and 9 Arcane. 40 Vigor is there because you're going to be in melee range and you're going to get hit. You're going to be wearing decent armor with this build, so you're not going to usually die in one hit, which is why you can get away with a little bit lower Vigor than some other melee builds. And also you need the points to get maximum damage from Intelligence, and you need points in Mind in order to be able to use these spells, particularly because you're using Lusat's Glintstone Staff, which increases your FP cost by 50%. So, getting less than 30 Mind is really non-negotiable with this build. 22 Endurance is there to give you not only more stamina, but in order to use the Great Shield and equip 2 staffs at the same time. If you're not going to use the Jellyfish Shield, you can drop some points here probably, as that'll reduce your equip load a lot. But I do like having substantial armor for this build because you are playing melee. So having some points in Endurance here really doesn't hurt because that stamina is great and protection is good. 20 Strength and 14 Dexterity are simply there to meet the requirements for the Jellyfish Shield. If you don't need that shield or you decide not to use it, you're going to go down to whatever it is for your class stats for these. So you can save probably like 10 points here at least, depending on what class you chose, and you can put those into Mind to have more FP, or you can put them into Vigor for more health, or you can put them in Endurance for more stamina and heavier armor. It's kind of up to you. 80 Intelligence is really the break point where points in Intelligence really don't add too much more to damage. They still will increase damage, so if you really want to keep cranking points there to get some, like maybe you go to NG Plus and you need to get some more damage, you'll probably put some points here eventually. But I do think at this point, if you're moving forward, the next 10 to 20 levels should be in either Vigor or Mind or maybe some Endurance first. Faith and Arcane are simply there because of the class that I began the game with. You don't need Faith or Arcane for this build. Theoretically, you could use Golden Vow to increase your damage by, another 15%, which wouldn't be bad if you are this class, a Confessor like me. Putting 11 points there is probably not a bad way to increase your damage. It'll probably outperform 11 points in Intelligence. But at this point in the game, you really don't want to put any more points there than you need. So I wouldn't invest there if you don't have to. And just a tip before I wrap up this video, if you're going to use the Flask of Wondrous Physique, you obviously want to use the Magic Shrouding tier to increase your magic damage for 3 minutes. Everything you do with this build is basically magic damage, so that's good. And then using the Cracked tier that increases your stamina recovery is also good. You don't have a ton of stamina, like you probably have some more than most builds that I've made, but you're not going to have a ton, and you want it to come back quickly so you can get back to spamming Carrion Slicer, or you can spam Carrion Slicer and then dodge away and, get out of range safely, because sometimes you're just going ham on Carrion Slicer and you might run out of stamina. So that's it for this Elden Ring build video. In the next one, I think I'm going to be doing a dual curved sword build, an evolution of the Bloodblade. People have been asking me for something like this that's not related to dragon spells at all, although I'm sure you could use it with that build. So stay tuned for that, and let me know what else you would like to see in the comments.